First, my name is Khalid Safouri. I'm the Executive Director of National Interest Foundation. And I would like to thank the organizers, especially Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber for this great conference, great work putting this together. Of course, Dania did the great work. This is a very nice event, a long event, but we'll try to do our best. And I will start here from my left with Dr. Courtney Freer. Dr. Courtney Freer is a research officer at Middle East Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science. You can read the full bio on the program, and I'll ask her to start 8 minutes. Then they will move to the other speakers, and I will introduce each of them separately. Okay.
Cool, great. I'm putting on the stopwatch, so hopefully I'll be brief. Thanks for having me. Thanks for staying till the end. So I guess what my remarks are going to focus on is basically what I've written a lot about, which is how political Islam functions in the rentier states of the Gulf specifically. I think a lot of times we look at the Gulf and we exceptionalize it. We think that the same ideologies, political ideologies that influence life in other parts of the Middle East are not actually relevant in the Gulf. And a lot of times people talk about kind of oil resources as being the reason for that. I think what a lot of my work has pointed out is essentially that just because there's oil wealth doesn't mean that there aren't Islamist groups, but it does shape how they work, and they do look different from Islamist groups elsewhere in the Middle East. And so I think specifically there are 3 activities that Muslim Brotherhood groups in particular undertake in states throughout the Middle East that are less relevant when it comes to the Gulf. The first of these, and most obviously, is due to handsome disbursements from rentier governments. Islamist movements don't need to, and indeed cannot really afford to, rival the government in terms of the provision of social welfare. So whereas in states like Egypt and Jordan, historically the Brotherhood and other Islamist movements have provided an alternative social safety net, this isn't needed in the Gulf, and so that's a big deal. Secondly, aside from Kuwait and Bahrain, the Muslim Brotherhood movements don't contest elections in the Gulf, and this is a huge part of what they do elsewhere in the Middle East. Third, due to the prevailing strength of kind of tribal social ties, the Brotherhood doesn't need to provide an alternate social network in the same way it has elsewhere. So this isn't kind of Cairo in the 1930s with a lot of newcomers needing, again, this very tangible social network. And so as a result, I think that Islamist movements, and I work specifically on the Muslim Brotherhood, are a lot more flexible structures than Brotherhood movements elsewhere. And this is largely due to the fact that they don't really provide as much tangibly as they do elsewhere. And I think there's also a lot of flexibility in terms of how they look across the Gulf. So the Brotherhood in Qatar looks very different from the Kuwaiti Brotherhood, largely due to political opportunity structures. So of course the Kuwaiti Brotherhood contests elections, and so that's a big part of their mandate. And so they do look quite different. Also, wealthy Gulf states are unique spaces for Islamist activity because there's a big role of the state in religious life. Of course, this is not unique to the Gulf. What is unique is that these governments can afford to spend a lot of money on the religious sector. You have, Sheikh Zayed Mosque, Quranic recitation competitions, huge kind of activities related to religion and related to the political leadership in these rentier states. And so I think that's something that's rather unique here. And so even when we have things like this campaign for so-called moderate Islam coming out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, there's this idea that the state needs to inform how people practice religion and that there's an appropriate way to practice it. And so I think that makes it difficult then for Islamist movements to come in and provide an alternate narrative when it comes to religion. As well, I think that these are interesting environments for Islamist movements because they're so demographically unbalanced. So, for instance, as we know in Qatar and UAE, expatriate populations are between kind of 80 to 90% of the total population. So in these kind of states, oftentimes political Islam can be linked to nationalism. Displaying your religiosity can be a means of displaying or reasserting national identity. So for instance, moves to promote things like the use of Arabic language can be at once seen as a means of reasserting national identity or of promoting kind of Arabic and Islamic education of the type that Muslim Brotherhood movements have traditionally supported. And I think that it's interesting that despite these obstacles faced by Muslim Brotherhood movements and other Islamist movements in the Gulf, Brotherhood branches and Salafi groups have existed in all 6 states of the GCC for decades. Beginning in the 1950s, many members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood fled to the Gulf and took up jobs, many of them in the education and judicial sectors. And in that way, they were able to influence a lot of social life, educational life since that time. And I think it's interesting to see the extent to which Gulf governments have developed very differing approaches to dealing with political Islam. And we can talk about that in more detail in kind of the Q&A, but I think it's kind of demonstrates the extent to which Islamist movements are seen as potentially politically dangerous. And I think that the places where we see more fear of Islamist movements is in places where they have historically had some role with secular opposition movements, where there's been some kind of unity of force in that sense. And so of course, we can talk about that. I'm very conscious of time. And so I think also these strategies are not only divergent when it comes to domestic politics, but also foreign policy, of course. So in a place like Qatar, where the Muslim Brotherhood was never very organized, never had a political branch, there's not that fear of the Muslim Brotherhood that you see in a place like Saudi Arabia, where the Sahwa movement was more politically active and politically vocal. And this has translated, I think, into foreign policies. One thing that, just to end my remarks, is to stress again that Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in these GCC states, they are politically and socially powerful. They're important, but I think that's not to say that they're necessarily a challenge to regime authority. They do provide kind of alternate ideological pillar. They provide ideological inspiration, social networks for people, but they're not necessarily kind of this challenge. Just because they have political and social capital doesn't mean that they're kind of seeking to overthrow the regimes or even able to do that. So I guess I'll stop there.
You still have 2 minutes.
I'll give them to Kristen.
Oh, good. I get my full 2 minutes then. Thank you. Thank you. I see Danya sitting in front of me, so I can thank her personally, but thank you for the whole GIF institution for the kind invitation. They asked me to speak about political Islam and electoral politics. I'm a very gracious guest, so I'm definitely going to cover that topic, but I'm hoping to also expand a bit beyond that, because I think, as we all know, electoral politics does not at all capture the full range of politics in these Gulf states. So I'm going to start by looking at the electoral system and then draw a few more conclusions and broader politics focused on the domestic arena, leaving some space for my colleagues that are going to look at the regional competition later. So in case I don't make it through the talk, and because it's been a long day, I'm going to give you the cliff notes and tell you the 3 points that I'm going to make. The first point when I'm looking at the electoral systems is to make exactly that point, that there are severe limitations to any of the electoral systems that we have in the Gulf states in terms of both participation and contestation, the 2 key elements of democracy as we would see them. 2, those limited openings that we have in the Gulf for representative politics have become, in almost all cases, more limited post-2011, when we had the popular uprisings and the domestic challenge that posed for the Gulf governments, and especially ruling family-led governments in the region. And then my third point will be to think about this shift then that's happening, or how they're actually using these the elected bodies, or these representative bodies that they have in the Gulf states. And I'm going to frame that much more in this really dominant shift that we've seen in the region, which is a shift towards nationalism as the master frame for all of these different states. So first, on the issue of limitations on participation and contestation, just want to get this out there. Obviously, participation is rather limited in who can participate. Foreign residents can't participate, which is obviously not anything surprising, but it's worth noting because the populations of some of these states are really overwhelmingly foreign residents. Of course, a lot of the populations have a significant number of bidun, who also, of course, cannot as well participate. Some countries, I believe, still have military or security forces. I'm not exactly sure if that's up to date, but that can participate. And some governments, if we're looking at like the Federal National Council in the UAE, they actually have electors. So the government selects a subset of the population who can participate in elections. Beyond these limitations on participation, there's quite sizable limitations on contestation, or the real meaningful ability of these bodies to provide real guidance into governance and oversight. Most of these councils, we're looking at most of the countries, they're advisory. So if we're looking at the Federal and National Councils in the UAE, Central Municipal Council in Qatar, Saudi municipal councils. They don't have legislative powers, and in fact, their oversight abilities are quite limited. Again, they are advisory. We could see more legislative power and more power for oversight, particularly in Kuwait with the National Assembly, and to some degree as well in the Bahrain Council of Representatives. So these are bodies that are actually legislative bodies, with Oman maybe following Shura Council, maybe somewhere in between. The second thing, of course, limits on contestation is you don't have parties in these states. You do have political societies, and I understand just recently this is coming up again in Kuwait where they're trying to push again for political parties. Post-2011, given this landscape of kind of limited representative politics in the Gulf states, post-2011, I'd say that's narrowed even more for a number of reasons, and I can just talk about a few sort of dynamics that the governments use to control this kind of unusual situation. And I would say, I mean, a lot of people ask, did the Gulf have an Arab Spring? I would say, in my opinion, and I follow youth politics a lot, I say absolutely. The Gulf states, I think, were quite sizably shaped by these politics, especially in Bahrain and Oman, I would say, and Kuwait as well. But even in the other states where you didn't have like street movements, there were real adjustments in the politics that took place. So we had a lot in the aftermath of the uprisings. We had punitive use of withdrawal of citizenship, so that obviously affected a lot of people who no longer can participate. We had the use of gerrymandering as well that affected people's ability, and the banning wholesale of political societies and some candidates as well who had been participating can no longer participate in elections. All of these things affected, not just Islamist movements, but I would say that they affected Islamist movements more than other movements because of the, if we're looking, for instance, of landing political societies in Bahrain, the Al-Wifaq political societies was a Shia Islamist society, was one of the main parties to demands for reform within the government that then got punished through these things. So it's interesting to think about. It's limiting the role of participation and contestation for everyone, but affects, I would say, the Islamist movements more than others. And in general, the way I see these bodies being reshaped, and I should mention too that in some cases you're just getting a full cancellation or delay of elections altogether. Of course, in Qatar, we're still waiting for elections for the Shura Council, which have been promised for some time, and that's been further delayed. And municipal council, I just saw in Saudi Arabia, even their very limited representation through municipal council, they're again delaying those elections, which are supposed to be taking place next year. So what are they doing with these bodies then? And really here in Saudi, we could look more like the Shura Council, Federal National Council, and even to some degree, the Council of Representatives in Bahrain, and even to some degree, Kuwait. I'd say that we're trying to move the governments in line with this new move towards nationalism as a way to allow for some participation, but in a very way that promotes kind of national unity and loyalty very much to ruling families. They're trying then to move from sort of a representative politics, kind of political contestation, to a politics of representation in these bodies. So all these tools that I described before are being used to kind of more effectively curate who's getting in, who's representing in these bodies, and what are some of the goals that they have? A lot of times to serve socio-political goals. More women participation, having more women in these leadership roles and within these parliaments. You can definitely see a move to push for that. To some degree, more youth, too. Another way to bring in youth candidates, to have a youth voice, have a way to say that. And pretty much like I said before, a more elimination of the movement, broadly speaking, candidates. So what you get is more independent, one more minute, okay, more independents that again are kind of supportive of government programs going forward, and not as much of this sort of messy contestation that we saw somewhat before. Just one last comment, like I said, that takes care of the electoral arena generally, very condensed. But one more thing about this nationalist orientation. Of course, when you take this very strong nationalist orientation, then I'd say Islamists in particular tend to fare very poorly under this new orientation, especially given what I'm sure Dr. Aras is going to speak about in the regional competition where this comes in. Because it very easily allows for certain, especially transnational or potentially transnational movements, to be portrayed as working outside of the national framework. This is the way they're often portrayed. And so then, of course, and even in some cases being portrayed as traitorous. So in the states where we've seen them cracking down much more on Islamists, and here I'm thinking about, of course, UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, then you see a really much more harsh kind of environment that's emerging within these states under this new national frame. So I'll stop there and happy to go into further in questions.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And I want to echo my colleagues here and thank the organizers for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to be back here in DC. I have a number of issues. One of them is the title of political Islam. Whether we agree with it or not. Is it the right, if you like, label for these movements? Some people will contest that it's overemphasized. What you should really call it is another way of how societies organize themselves, and it's basically a movement that uses Islam as a tool. And I think the region has seen that there are always been one ideology or the other that has permeated through the region, whether it is Marxism or leftist ideas, socialist ideas, Baathism, Nasserism. All of those isms have always, come and gone in the region. And Islamic movements were part of them. In those days, they were not very popular, of course. However, national governments across the region, not just in the Gulf, particularly not in the Gulf, across the region, they have fought against all these ideologies. And in a sense, in the Gulf, they used the Muslim movements as an antidote against all these ideologies. So when Egypt and Syria and Iraq were pushing all those Muslim brotherhoods and Islamists, as it were, out of their own countries, they were welcomed with open arms into the Gulf. They needed them for two reasons, at least. One is to protect against these kind of alien ideologies that are coming from abroad, from outside the region. And secondly, they needed them because they needed their know-how, knowledge to construct their education system, administrative systems, etc. So in most of the countries in the Gulf states, the Muslim Brotherhood in particular had played a very important role in the education system, in health, in administration, government policies. All of that were it has the full footprint of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were welcomed with open arms. The only problem with the Brotherhood, I think, occurred, and they became an enemy, is when they sided with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Then there was a problem there. But as you kindly mentioned earlier, it's also the Arab Spring that kind of focused the attention on the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, why do they or these movements occur? Well, it's natural that any society needs to kind of organize itself around a certain, if you like, theme or ideology or ideas, etc. Unfortunately, in the Arab Gulf states in particular, in those days, societal organizations were not allowed. As I said, all those kind of isms that were coming from abroad, they were not allowed. They were fought with vengeance from the regimes. However, they allowed this for the Muslim movement, thinking that this is, very compatible with the society. They're helping us against the invasion of different ideas, etc. And they were given the most important things, I said, education and mosques, and sometimes information. So, these are the most powerful tools that you could give to any, if you like, movement. And Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic groups, however, they were given these tools, and they were able to kind of convince people around them. And it was easy to kind of bring in people because, especially when in countries where there is mismanagement or bad governance or lack of economic development, it can galvanize people around those ideas. Now, fortunately, in the Gulf states, we didn't have those ills, if you like, that we had in the other countries. It's not that we are not without our own ills, but they are not at the same level as they were in other countries. So, there are legitimacies for the regimes and for the royal families, and people accept that. They want better, of course, government, and then that's a questionable, but they want better administration. They want to share more in the, if you like, in the political process. They want to share more in the economic cake, as it were. And that is, the governments are very respondent to that. Differs from one country to the other. And now we have seen recently in many countries they are allowing, as you just mentioned, Christine, there is, also a kind of participation in the public decision making and policy making through parliaments, etc. So the space that these groups wanted to have, the government is occupying them and allowing people to do so, opening the space for them, opening for the people to participate in elections, allowing societies to form themselves, whether it's municipal elections as well, or whether it's functional societies like people who care for the environment, or people who care for health or any particular issues. It's been allowed. In the past, these things were not allowed. So the governments are really opening up. And therefore, they are taking the space where these kind of movements, Islamic movements, whatever movement wants to, you want to call it, used to occupy. And of course, there was no need for the grassroots support that the Brotherhood used to do in poor societies like in Egypt and so on, because we didn't have that. The government actually moved in there in the Gulf, and they are supporting the population. So I think the fear of political Islam or Islamic movements is over-exaggerated. It's not to say that they are not there. They are. And some of them are really, kind of concentrating on piety, concentrating on spreading their Islamic ideals, educating people. And we have to understand, these are, at the end, Muslim communities, and they are, they're Muslim people. So they accept these ideologies, they accept their teaching, and they feel more comfortable with these groups. However, it's only when it comes to be political. This is when they start kind of getting into conflict with the government. And the governments are too powerful in our part of the world, especially in the Gulf states, and the government apparatus is too strong. And I don't think anybody there really want to see kind of a change or a revolution or anything like that. So political Islam in Egypt, political Islam in Syria, or other countries, or Sudan, is different from the way that we see it in the Gulf. And I think we should not just taint them with the same brush because they are two different animals, although they carry the same title as Islam Brotherhood or Salafis or Shi'as. They are different because of the socio-economic situation in each country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for invitation and thanks for staying to listen us. So I was asked to present Turkey's use of political Islam in its foreign policy and its involvement in regional rivalry. So I checked the recent literature, and there is almost a consensus that Turkey uses political Islam in its foreign policy. Generally speaking, foreign policy is about maximizing national interest abroad. But in Turkish case, historically, it has been about bringing success stories from outside back home to consolidate political support. This was, more in case under Justice and Development Party, since JDP, Justice and Development Party, had difficulties to consolidate its rule in its early phase up to 2008, 2009. Whenever they had a problem at home, they brought, a success story from outside to open up political space themselves in domestic politics. When it comes to, Arab Spring 2011, Justice and Development Party already developed a kind of self-confidence that they can, achieve some greater things outside, and they can be, more active in foreign policy outside. And they recognized Arab Spring as an opportunity to expand Turkey's sphere of influence and develop, relations with a number of Arab countries. Historically speaking, Turkey, the traditional Turkish policy line was to keep, at arm's length with the Arab world, probably with the exception of the Palestinian issue. But however, there was, in the minds of policymakers, a perfect moment to open up to, this Arab contagion, which is facing a transformation. Justice and Development Party first approach to this, emerging, in their thinking, the newly emerging Arab world with the idea of, suggesting Turkish model. The first component of the Turkish model they suggested to Arab world is this secular rule. But however, their trial of selling the secular Turkish model did not resonate with the Arab masses at that time. And there were several reasons for that. First of all, they did not have a clue about the ongoing discussion on the secularism within the Arab world. And they never had, a close touch with the secular Arab intellectuals and what they are thinking on secularism on their own. And also, they did not recognize the Arab world's experience with the secularisms, like Tunisia and some other countries. And the third reason was that, these Arab secular liberal intellectuals were also suspicious about Justice and Development parties. They thought, it has some, hidden agenda in their approach to over there, since Justice and Development Party has its own roots of political Islam as well. Well, the nodal point here in the sense of, views of political Islam in foreign policy has been Justice and Development Party's recognition that there is another group, another segment of society in this Arab world which is, more welcoming to Turkey, and they were, at least receptive of Turkey's approach to them. And there was also one dynamic section of those society. There was Muslim Brotherhood. So after the recognition that, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, they are extending, a welcoming attitude to them, they prefer to this time, promote in another version of Turkish model, which is more Muslim democratic country, which is, sort of a Muslim democracy, and it can work in those countries as a model. And this kind of, created a resonance with Muslim Brotherhood in different countries as well. So in the background is this, again, this search for success in foreign policy and develop relations with new Arab countries. And the recognition is that Turkey can easily have access to the emerging leadership in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and who knows, maybe in other countries. kind of created a motivation to pursue closer relation with Muslim Brotherhood and similar groups in those countries. And this turned out to be a regional policy line in Ankara. Well, it also resulted in a transformation of Turkey's regional policy. For example, in 2009, there was Turkey was the most supported country among the Iraqi Shia in 2009. But later on, after Arab Spring, after Turkey's willing attitude to approach the Muslim Brotherhood in the regional landscape, Turkey emerged as a country promoting Sunni Islam in this geography. And to some extent, they lost Shia in the region. But however, on the other hand, because of this choice of Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey also lost some major Sunni countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE because of miscalculation that this choice is going to lead to a rivalry with other countries, and also Turkey's miscalculation that probably lack of vision to forecast that this power is going to, in the Arab world, power is going to shift to Gulf. There's going to be a Gulf momentum. Well, Turkey made an intervention in this sense and developed close relations with Qatar, which kind of, the visions were more or less coinciding. And this has been somehow meeting in the halfway with similar agendas. Well, a foreign policy analysis requires, a cost-benefit analysis. What did Turkey gain appropriating a political Islam line in its regional policy, and what it lost? The benefit is Turkey gained Qatar, but this is not only because of the support and similar groups in the regional landscape. There are some other reasons as well, but there is a coinciding, convergent perspective, Turkey and Qatar, in approaching to Muslim Brotherhood and moderate Muslim groups. Well, the countries like Libya and Syria, Turkey gained access to some proxies. Historically speaking, Turkey never had any contact with some proxy groups and never used the proxies in regional policy. Now, it's a gain or not, I don't know, but Turkey has proxies in Syria, Libya, and other places because of this approach, closeness to the moderate Muslim groups in different parts of this Arab world. Well, another thing Turkish policymakers keep saying that, and a sympathy within the Arab street. This is what Turkey gained through using political Islam in its foreign policy, and also the grassroots connection. This is what they suggest, and they say that they have in the Arab geography, which kind of helps Turkey's current search for allies in the Arab world, in Sudan, Libya, and probably in Yemen. Well, on the negative side, having this approach in foreign policy, Turkey lost relations with major Sunni Arab countries, and in particular after the this Gulf crisis in the GCC, with its accelerating impact, Turkey now engages in a rivalry with Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the geography and even beyond. That rivalry is costly to Turkey, and on the the cost side, there is also an emerging domestic criticism. Why Turkey is doing this? Why Justice and Development Party had this line of political Islam in the regional policy. So it says it's a major diversion from the traditional foreign policy line, and Turkey didn't gain much out of it. So and the criticism largely relies on while trying to gain access to Arab geography, at the end, what happened is losing almost all Arab world, with the exception of Qatar. So this is, an emerging domestic discussion in Turkey. Well, this is more or less what I.
Well, thank you,
what I'm
Dr.
gonna say.
Arras.
Thank you.
I was handed a card. It is telling me that.